Hey, hello everybody. Welcome back to the E3SM Biogeochemistry webinar. As you know, we have a mixture of speakers in this webinar from within the E3SM project and external speakers who are working on projects related to E3SM or have interesting insights to share with us. And I'm very happy that today we are able to have a presentation from Forrest Hoffman, who leads the RUBISCO project, which is a scientific focus area sponsored by DOE through the Regional and Global Climate Modeling Program. And we're going to get an update from Forrest today about some of the interesting recent results from that project. So I think with that, I'll hand it over to Forrest, and I'll look forward to hearing the talk. Thanks, Forrest.
Sure, Susanna. Yeah, so Susanna asked me to give a talk about RUBISCO, and I wasn't sure if she meant the enzyme or the project, but it sounds like I picked the right one. So I thought I'd just give like an informal discussion of the project. There are a number of people that are part of the coupled biogeochemistry group here who are also part of this project, and so could also be giving this talk. But I thought I'd just run you through some of the highlights and some of the work that we've been doing lately, and maybe talk a little bit about some of the goals in the project. Trying to see if this updates. There we go. All right. So yeah, as Susanna was mentioning, this is an activity that's funded by DOE's Regional and Global Model Analysis Program, and it's a project that I'm co-leading with Bill Riley out at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and with Jim Randerson at UC Irvine, who's our chief scientist. And the goals of the project are really to identify and quantify interactions between biogeochemical cycles in the Earth system. And these cycles are across all components in the Earth system. We're interested in reducing uncertainties associated with these interactions from Earth system models, and trying to really understand how best to improve models. So we do hypothesis-driven research, looking at biogeochemical and hydrological processes and feedbacks from Earth system models. We also do a good deal of data work. So we synthesize in situ and remote sensing data and design new metrics for evaluating models. We have some very specific targets as a part of the project. One is to design and develop and release the International Land Model benchmarking tools and a similar associated ocean benchmarking toolkit to offer, systematic evaluation of model fidelity, either during development or during validation activities for things like model intercomparison projects. We're also involved with a variety of CMIP6 activities and experiments, and working on running some simulations in collaboration with this team using the E3SM model. We kind of think of ourselves as sitting in between the measurements community and the Earth system modeling community, so that we try to get the latest and greatest and best available observational data to confront Earth system models, and then develop these benchmarking packages to help us do that in a more systematic way. And that also offers a nice opportunity to get data sets in the hands of modelers more quickly. If we can go ahead and implement it into a benchmarking package where it's just there, then modelers can take advantage of it more rapidly. So we also sort of consider that we have feedbacks both to the modeling community about weaknesses and gaps in the models based on our analyses, but also back to the measurements community about other kinds of measurement campaigns or other kinds of measurements that could be made to help us better assess models going forward. We think of ourselves as sitting as a part of this kind of circular model data experiment enterprise within DOE, where knowledge gaps are identified over here on the right in about the 3 o'clock position. Then process research and site characterization and experimental design is done. Field measurements, manipulative experiments are conducted, and this provides a lot of data that needs to be synthesized, scaled, and integrated in a variety of ways that then feeds back to improving and informing model development with modular designs. And then where we think we sit is kind of in this model simulation, evaluation, and analysis and benchmarking corner up here to then provide more information about additional gaps that need to be addressed through other parts of the larger DOE program. But falling out of all of these activities are a set of data centers and data sets and tools and models and a bunch of activities that generate community available analysis capabilities. And so ILAMB is one of those, E3SM is one of those models. Things like ESS Dive or the ARM Data Archive are other resources that come out of this larger enterprise. Within RUBISCO, we aren't a very big activity, but we have a lot of partnerships. So we have 5 national labs involved, including Argonne, Brookhaven, Los Alamos, Berkeley, and Oak Ridge. We partner with NCAR, and we have university collaborators at UC Irvine, University of Michigan, and Northern Arizona University. Some of the things that we do and have been working on recently include, standard contributions to organizing sessions and presenting our science at AGU, at a recent AGU Chapman conference, and at ESA, Ecological Society of America annual meetings. We have strong interactions with this group at E3SM, as well as the groups in CESM for land and ocean biogeochemistry, in evaluation with ILAMB and IOMB. There's a number of us involved in CMIP6 MIPs like C4 MIP, the land use MIP, LS3 MIP, etc. And then a number of us in the project are also working directly on CESM working groups, contributing there. We're involved in external groups as well, like the International Soil Radiocarbon Database Project. And as a part of RUBISCO, we're right now leading 2 working groups, active working groups, one focused on soil carbon dynamics and another on collaborations with Ameriflux and FluxNet. And the idea here is to improve data sets and develop new evaluation metrics by bringing together multidisciplinary teams and working with remote sensing researchers and observationalists. We're also participating with a bunch of other groups at NCAR, GFDL, PNNL, Oak Ridge, and universities on a couple of new co-funded NOAA climate process team projects. We think that we're kind of unique in that we can focus on biogeochemical feedbacks in the Earth system from a larger perspective. So we need a multidisciplinary team, and we need access to high-performance computing to run various Earth system models and evaluation software and use these models. So we look at coupling across different reservoirs and long-range ecological teleconnections, and work on, as I mentioned, delivering tools to the community. And then we also do have some level of effort into community engagement. So we have our own monthly Biogeochemistry Science Friday webinars. We have topical working groups that I just mentioned. We also do a couple of national and a couple of international trips every year where we offer tutorials on the use of ILAMB and its development. And then recently we participated in a CMIP6 hackathon. Some of the accomplishments, I would say, in the most recent phase of the SFA are really streamlining ILAMB, so doing a lot of new development and applying it for various international model intercomparison projects. We have some fairly high impact science and global biogeochemical cycles. I'll talk about a few papers in a minute. And then those community engagement activities that I mentioned. So this year we put out a paper on the design and philosophy of version 2 of ILAMB that was led by Nate Collier. The package has been used during development and for validation with ELM by this group and for CLM. And ILAMB version 2 was also used as a part of the Global Carbon Project to evaluate TRENDY models, and is used by other modeling centers as well, like MPI, the Hadley Center, Canadian Climate Center, University of Tokyo, et cetera, to routinely evaluate their land surface models. We have a figure that right now we're working on a paper for to get into the 5th chapter for IPCC AR6, looking at comparisons of CMIP5 versus CMIP6 models to judge their performance. We had about, these are just sort of management metrics, but they're interesting to track. We had about 37 papers out of the project in FY 2018, 43 so far in FY 2019, which just ended. A couple of these are science series over the course of the project, and about 15 in the nature series. We have some other metrics there, but we're fairly productive with about 5 papers per FTE and more than 10,000 citations since the beginning of the project about 7, 8, 9 years ago. So we like to go quote H-index as if the project were a researcher would have an H-index of about 50. So some of the recent science is listed here. So we had one of the first applications of the detection and attribution methodology to terrestrial biogeochemistry and hydrology that is work that Jiafu Mao has been working on for a while. We're working on novel information transfer methods to infer coupling between land, atmosphere, and ocean, and there's a paper by the Berkeley team on that. The first mechanistic explanation of fire effects on high latitude vegetation and carbon cycling. And then discovery of new ecological teleconnections. We have a paper that is led by Weiwei Fu at UC Irvine that looks at the loss of Antarctic sea ice, which triggers a large decline in global marine productivity and fisheries. Actually, that one's from Keith. So those teleconnections. Weiwei has also got a paper that he talked about recently that forms this sees a kind of lensing effect in the Arctic region. So that may be on the next slide or not. Okay, and then the first estimate of temperature limitations on carbon cycling at high latitudes from observation in comparison with CMIP models. One of the first mechanistic explanations of precip and soil moisture changes in the Amazon basin in response to rising atmospheric CO2 and spumato closure. One of the first estimates of carbon cycle feedbacks from economic damages, which is kind of an interesting new area. New constraints on ocean nutrient distributions, both nitrogen and phosphorus, and new understanding of the impact of land-atmosphere coupling on temperature and carbon from El Nino using E3SM, which is work that Paul Levine has led. I'll walk through a few of these things. So in the detection and attribution, Whitney Forbes, working with Jiafu Mao, had a fairly recent paper in Environmental Research Letters looking at environmental forcings and what their contributions are to runoff changes from 1950 to 2010. She found that changing trends and looking at resolving environmental driving mechanisms for U.S. runoff during that time period, applied single-factor land surface model simulations to conduct this detailed DNA analysis to address the causality of changes in runoff. And if you look at the figures on the right-hand side, you can see, for instance, the pink areas are in each of these factorial simulations are the areas where a human fingerprint is detectable for the climate change effect, for CO2, concentration effect, for nitrogen deposition, and land use change. Obviously, the climate change effect is a large one, and land use change probably second most significant. With regard to new evaluation methods, Cheng and Bill, working with Liu at Berkeley, have developed this information theory methodology to look at directional precip interactions over the western Sahel using observations and models. And doing that, they found that that most models either incorporate this unidirectional control of sea surface temperatures on precip or a bidirectional interaction between vegetation and precipitation, but none of the models really showed both controls. GFDL and IPSL models did the best job in reproducing observed patterns for about half of the western Sahel, and but weren't accurate in reproducing the observed regional trends or interannual variability on precip. And so these are the kinds of analyses that we do that hopefully feed back into improvements in models. And then another paper, again, actually the same paper, where, okay, Bill is showing here the interactions between sea surface temperature, vegetation, and precip. So this just sort of is another graphical display of some of those results. We also expect this to result in a new benchmark that we can incorporate into ILAMB. For ocean teleconnections, this is the paper I mentioned a minute ago that Keith led about a year ago in Science, looking at sustained warming. It causes this sort of nutrient trapping effect in Antarctica and results in large productivity losses in the open ocean. And Keith and his colleagues estimated that that declining productivity reduces the potential global fisheries catch by about 20%, with declines largest in the North Atlantic being around 60%. And of course, that's where we get a lot of the fish that we eat. So we're very interested in looking at other simulations like this that go out to the year 2300 to see if we see those same kinds of circulation-induced and biogeochemical interaction-induced effects from other Earth system models. And Abby Swan and I are co-organizing a AAAS panel to discuss these kinds of long-term ocean and land biogeochemical effects at the AAAS meeting in February. So if people are planning to attend that meeting, be sure to check that out. We'll also look at plant physiological responses to warming. So here's work from Bill Riley and Trevor Keenan on greening of the land surface at high latitudes. And the idea was to combine satellite observations over the contemporary era with CMIP-5 simulations and to look at these functional responses of vegetation over the cold regions. So observations indicated a greening effect at high latitudes over the past 3 to 4 decades related to recent warming. And CMIP-5 models didn't really produce the same strength of these effects. And so they have large biases in vegetation cover that limit their ability to capture those effects of greening due to warming. Physiological effects. So this is a paper that Gabe Cooperman put together as he was finishing up his work with Mike and Jim at UC Irvine, looking at future flood risk based on both the stomatal conductance effect on transpiration as well as changes in precipitation. And while he found that typical runoff intensity over the tropics didn't change a lot in the mean, but the extremes changed significantly and were attributed to this physiological effect. So while the means may be fairly consistent and constant over time, you really have to look at what those extreme effects are, and they can, in fact, be driven by these large physiological responses to increasing atmospheric CO2. marine nutrient constraints. So there are a couple of papers, fairly recent papers here. This one in Nature, Keith Moore and his colleagues estimated global scale marine nitrogen fixation to look at mechanisms that, and looked at mechanisms that control this fixation and links to carbon cycling. They looked at results from an inverse model to constrain various forms of nitrogen, and then diagnosed CESM2 simulations to find other possible mechanisms. So this paper kind of offers this kind of constraint on how models should be capturing nitrogen dynamics in the ocean. And so we're hoping this leads to an IOMB new metric. We're also very interested in these biogeochemical and hydrological interactions, so which you could tell already. This was a paper that Paul Levine at UC Irvine led as a part of his dissertation research. So he looked at soil moisture variability and how it changes and intensifies the El Nino effect. So we actually, using E3SM running AMIP style force with observed SSTs, looked that during the wet season, the contrast between the El Nino and La Nina is driven by these coupled ocean atmosphere teleconnections, but anomalies in the soil moisture persist into the dry season after the ENSO in the eastern Amazon, and this actually causes continued warming, strengthening, and extending of these high temperatures and these dry carbon cycle responses due to ENSO. So it's like this kind of double whammy when you get hit by an ENSO in the eastern Amazon. With CMIP6 activities, I put up here a picture of the spreadsheet that we've developed collaboratively with the coupled biogeochemistry group here on some of the simulations that we hope to conduct with E3SM. So we're working on those now. We're doing a variety of analyses since papers need to be submitted by the end of this year. Within the RGMA, the larger RGMA program, we co-organized me and John Liu at NERSC, Paul Ulrich at UC Davis, Mike Wayner at Lawrence Berkeley, and Wilbert Weiger at Los Alamos, put together a program to cache some commonly used CMIP model output at NERSC, and ran a hackathon to get people involved in, kicked off, and started on some of the analyses that we hope will result in new papers. And then we're tracking some of those papers as a part across the RGMA program. I'm going to talk a little bit quickly here about ILAMB. So ILAMB was first conceived back at a workshop that we had in Exeter back in 2009. We held a second workshop in Irvine, California in 2011. That was a much larger workshop where we had about 45 researchers from international locations, really looking at methodology, how do we do model data comparison and establish baseline standards that the international community could agree upon. And Ichi Lo led a paper out of that activity. In 2016, we had the third ILAMB workshop, and this was in Washington, D.C., so it was larger still. We had about 60 participants, including about 10 of the international modeling centers. We also had about 25 remote attendees at any one time. This was a nice way to engage a larger segment of our scientific community, both students and postdocs who were possibly unable to travel, some from international locations, and often females in traditional family raising roles who were able to participate directly in our activity, even though they weren't able to travel there for one reason or another. And here our goals were really to extend and design new metrics for model benchmarking, to look at work that had been done by other groups since the previous workshop in model data comparisons, to identify what MIP evaluation needs there were, in particular for CMIP6, and then consider how to improve model development and feed information out of tools like ILAMB to inform future model development. and also to share information about newest observational data sets and additional measurements that we need to ask the measurements community to take up. The first version of ILAMB was released in 2015 at the AGU fall meeting, and version 2 that we're on now came from this third workshop in 2016. It's open source software and freely distributed. It's routinely used by this community and CESM to evaluate the models during development. We have done some work looking at CMIP5 models. The models, again, I think everybody on this call is aware of the kind of metrics and statistical comparisons like bias, RMSE, phase, amplitude, spatial distribution, Taylor score, and functional response metrics that we use. This is a highlight from Nate's paper this last year, which really described the philosophy of the software and documented a lot of the work that went into the decisions about how to evaluate the models, how to deal with scaling issues, etc. Currently, there's a whole list of biogeochemical, hydrological, and energy variables that we evaluate using observational data sets from various sources. We also look at the forcing so that we know, for instance, for fully coupled simulations, we have a lens through which to look at the land model results. Ching recently had a paper looking at the evaluation of the E3SM land model, looking at nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon interactions. In that paper, the majority of the figures from the paper highlighted ILAMB benchmarking results and compared to previous versions of CLM. David Lawrence led a paper describing CLM5, which is the latest version there that I think went to press the last week or two, looking at improvements in the mechanistic treatment of hydrology, ecology, and land use, and many other parts of the model. And this is kind of what you want to see out of ILAMB, is that as you move from left to right, from CLM4 to 4.5 to 5, that you're mostly getting bluer, and so all the brown is on the left. So this is the kind of improvement that you'd like to see. This is just an example of some graphical diagnostics. Probably everybody here has seen these before. It's from GPP. Spatial Taylor diagram, regional means, annual cycles, monthly anomaly, etc. This is an example of some of our variable-to-variable comparisons. So here we're looking at GPP responses to precipitation globally. So we think even if the forcing is not quite right, we should be able to see how the model does overall in these relationships between dependent variables like this. Gordon Bonin at NCAR recently led a paper that used ILAMB to look at CLM4, 4.5, and 5 with two different sets of forcing, and to look at, in particular, at the cumulative land carbon sink for CMIP5 versus the CLM models. And he really showed that, land model performance depends very strongly on forcing, and that with two different, equally accepted forcings, we may choose two different models as the best model to use, depending on which metrics and which forcings we're running that model with. And I'm just going to mention briefly IOMB. So this is a package that we're starting to use, and it's based completely on the ILAMB code base. It also runs in parallel as open source and everything. So we just have a separate configuration file and some additional code in there to do multi-level evaluations within the ocean model. So we're still working on those developments. And I mentioned earlier that the global carbon budget for 2018 used ILAMB to evaluate the TRENDY DGVMs. So there was a figure there, and there's supplemental information. And that we're now looking at comparisons of CMIP5 versus CMIP6 land models. The first 10 or so columns here on the right that are mostly brown are CMIP5 models. So you can see that most of the blue is on the right-hand side of this figure. And so that indicates that overall the CMIP6 models are looking better than the CMIP5 models. So we're spending time now to kind of drill down and see what kinds of factors are leading to these improvements, and trying to determine how much of that is due to forcing and how much may be due to this additional complexity that's added to the models as we try to make them better as we go along. In ILAMB, we're also doing some work now to address observational uncertainty. So very few data sets actually provide complete uncertainties. So we use multiple data sets right now where for many variables, and we allow users to weight them according to some rubric for uncertainty, scale mismatch, et cetera, that we have. But ILAMB can also take advantage of spatial and temporal uncertainties if they're provided with the data. And we now have a mechanism for allowing users to set a fixed kind of expert-derived data set uncertainty, like plus or minus 1 ppm or plus or minus 0.2 millimeters per day. And then we've done some work messing around with taking multiple data sets and deriving uncertainties by looking at means and standard deviations across multiple versions of truth data sets that we have. So we're doing work in this area and hoping to have a paper or two on this in the next year or two. And then I want to say real quickly here some additional words about the working group. So we have a soil carbon dynamics working group that met here in Oak Ridge about a year ago. We've had a variety of phone calls. And again, this working group kind of came out of the ILAMB workshop report. We want to apply data and models to improve predictive understanding, of course, but in particular, we want to improve our knowledge and data in order to come up with better metrics and evaluations in ILAMB. So here we have two different themes that came out of that group. First is a global data synthesis theme, where we are looking at trying to build better databases, including the information from the International Soil Carbon Network and published literature, to provide additional constraints on soil organic matter, and trying to quantify the vertical distribution of SOM and responses to controlling mechanisms. And then a second theme on model data integration, trying to work closely with microbially explicit soil carbon models to come up with standard data sets for initialization, forcing, and benchmarking, and then characterize model structural uncertainty through software frameworks to understand controlling mechanisms in those models that we can then potentially constrain. And then a second working group that met a few weeks ago out at Berkeley, again coming out of the same workshop report. We had about 35 or 40 people at that workshop, and a whole variety of interesting topics are being looked at, like multi-factor responses. There's a lot of interest with this long Ameriflux record in the potential for looking at responses to extreme events and return times on ecosystem resilience, long-term trends, doing various kinds of mathematical time series or harmonic analyses out of some of these larger data sets, developing some supersite benchmarks, and applying various scaling methodologies to help us build data sets. And then finally, the CMIP6 hackathon that I already mentioned for the larger RGMA program. We have a Slack workspace set up, a GitHub repository for collecting scripts and analysis codes, and Jupyter notebooks that people can check in there. And we are getting close to filling up the 2 petabyte space that we have at NERSC, where we're caching some CMIP6 output. So this is an activity that's gotten some attention at DOE, and Gary Gernhardt presented a slide similar to this one at the BERAC meeting last week, talking about the importance of these kinds of collaborative, larger programmatic activities We're hoping that this actually results in new analysis papers, which would really be the measure of success for the activity. And with that, I'll just end and take any questions.